When we think of Rome, we have a tendency to think of it in its greatest accomplishments, its towering architecture, incredible engineering, vast and powerful armies, and its huge territories. But for a very long time, Rome was a minor player, a city-state, like many others, and it took decades for Rome to even gain a foothold in just Italy. On today's Ground Up History, I built a diorama of the city of Veii. An Etruscan city-state just north of Rome, which rivaled Rome for decades. The two were bitter rival cities, almost like Athens and Sparta. And when Rome finally overcame Veii and conquered the city, it was its first step on its ascension to control of central Italy and eventually building its empire more broadly. And while I go over this diorama, I'm also going to do a general discussion about why Rome is so unique in European history. No other empire, even close to its scale, has existed since, and any that got close didn't last particularly long. So how was it that Rome was able to build the empire it did? And was the fall of Rome actually potentially beneficial for Europe? So, hi all, welcome back to Ground Up History, and I am not Marcus Furius Camillus.
Alright, so to start off, I'm just going to take some nice foam offcuts. You can see my cat helping me out with it there. And basically just using this to form out the baseline for what the diorama is going to be. The city of Veii was built on a hilltop with two rivers around it, a very natural fortress. And one of the cool things about Veii that made it so powerful was, in fact, that they actually carved the hilltop out. The walls of the city were built in such a way that the earth of the hill was carved away, and then a brick wall was fastened as a sort of barrier, and then that dirt was placed back above it, essentially extending the hilltop surface so there was more room for the city within the walls, and turning the exterior of the hill into a rocky cliff face that would make it very difficult to assail. I didn't quite capture this the way I wanted to. The walls from the actual surface of the city wouldn't have looked particularly tall, but it does speak to the ingenuity and engineering skill of the Etruscan peoples. And that's sort of the main point of that contentious title I gave this video. It's not so much that Rome was unimpressive or uninventive as to why I would claim Rome was holding Europe back, but in fact that many of the peoples that were around Rome were just as impressive as they were, and in fact inspired a lot of Rome would become. You can see here I've laid out a kind of plaster and glue mix to set up the ground, and now I'm painting on some rivers, and then I'll paint in some paths. And these rivers are also fascinating because they ended up being Veii's downfall. Veii was famous for its hydraulic engineering. It had a huge cistern under the city, and many Etruscan cities had excellent hydraulic engineering as well. As much as Rome is famous for things like aqueducts, peoples like the Etruscans and the Greeks were able to achieve similar feats of engineering. What Rome's greatest skill wasn't that they were uniquely enlightened amongst the people of their time, but in fact they were able to learn from their rivals, adapt their technologies for their own usage, and then improve on them. When Rome in its early years was building its empire, it took centuries for Rome to even gain supremacy within Italy itself. In the earliest days of Rome, when it was a city-state, Italy was split between many vying powers, some of which were quite major. The Etruscans were a large, massive power that had existed as predominant in north-central Italy for hundreds of years. They had advanced art, engineering, architecture, powerful armies, and a great deal of wealth. As well, to the south, in what's now the boot of Italy, was a region known as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, and this was full of very powerful Greek city-states. And amongst the mountains were the various Italic tribes, one of the most notable being the Samnites, who would definitely defeat Rome a few times, much as they tried to erase that from their own history. And in the north, of course, you had the Celts, who would actually almost destroy Rome and caused a great deal of havoc for the Italian peoples. All of these factions gave Rome various headaches, and it took literal centuries for Rome to gain prominence just in Italy, overcoming these various rivals and eventually gaining supremacy over them. Roman expansion was slow and came at high prices. Just defeating the single city-state of Veii took decades, and when Rome finally overcame them, it was a huge step on the road towards Rome finally gaining supremacy within central Italy. But overcoming these enemies is part of what made Rome so powerful. Like I mentioned already with things like aqueducts, much of what we attribute to Roman ingenuity was in fact already in practice by peoples they were encountering. Militarily, Rome for a long time fought like Greeks. They used a phalanx formation with round shields and long spears. But after experience fighting with the Celts and the Samnites, they realized that in rough mountainous terrain, the sword and shield, and particularly the square shield they're so famous for, were much more useful. Even things like gladiatorial combat were actually Etruscan. The Etruscans also had gladiators, and we often attribute the Roman pantheon to being a ripoff of the Greeks, but there was also a lot of Etruscan influence there. The Etruscan goddess Minerva shared a name with the Roman goddess Minerva, and very many characteristics. The Romans drew a lot from a lot of cultures. They learned from their enemies and adapted that technology. And they did so brilliantly. I don't mean to disparage Rome's achievements. It's shockingly impressive, the empire they were able to build, especially when you consider no other empire in Europe of that same scale would exist ever again in European history, not least for that length of time on the European continent itself. Europe is a very geographically difficult region to try to unify. It's split by huge mountain ranges. The rivers don't necessarily connect in a strategic way, and it's very climactically different, so there's not necessarily a sort of uniform approach to organization and economics that you can apply across the entire continent. A lot of what allowed Rome to become that single, unique European empire came down, frankly, to luck. Rome overcoming its Italian rivals was an impressive feat, sure, but then it suddenly was faced with another, older empire, a superpower in its own right, the Carthaginians. But by the time Rome was fighting Carthage, it had already started to fall into complacency. The Carthaginian Empire was dependent on mercenaries. A powerful kleptocratic class of merchants and noble families ran the country for their own interest, and it had gotten involved in a few very costly campaigns that had weakened the national strength. When Rome fought the Carthaginians, the wars they fought were brutal. The First Punic War was the first conflict in that region of Europe that had 1 million combatants, a conflict that wouldn't happen at that scale again until the 17th century. It was staggering, the level of violence that these two inflicted on each other, but Rome was a rising power and Carthage was a falling one. And when Rome encountered Carthaginian warships that were far better than their own, the Romans reverse-engineered the Carthaginian vessels and made their own, allowing them to overcome the Carthaginians after creating a further invention, essentially a drawbridge that turned naval warfare from a ramming game into a boarding action, where the Romans excelled. When the Romans fought the Greeks, they were going up against a Macedonian army that had just conquered the oldest and most powerful empire any European had known, the Persian Empire. It was believed in this period that the phalanx of the Macedonians with their long pikes was immortal. It was the preeminent army, but Rome found a way to overcome it. They adapted, learned so effectively. They were able to defeat enemies that had taken for granted their status. But of course, while considering that, you also have to consider Macedon had fallen into chaos after Alexander's death. A bunch of rival generals, now essentially regional warlords, were in constant civil war with each other. So Rome never had to face an empire enemy like Alexander had in the Persian Empire. And the ones that they did face, the Parthians, managed to stop them. before they could really conquer much further into the Middle East than the Levant. As well, in Western Europe, Rome had the advantage of going up against semi-developed civilizations. And what I mean by that is the Celts, the Hispanians, and the Brits were all in a state of developing into more major civilizations, but they hadn't quite gotten there yet. So there were significant populations and large urban centers and the basics of infrastructure, roadways, farm systems, irrigation, but there wasn't the kind of development and organization required to create armies capable of defeating Rome's. So when Rome conquered a region like Gaul, of course it was an epic fight. Millions were killed or enslaved by the Romans in the aftermath of it, but it gave Rome a huge region rich in resources, with a lot of population and a lot of urban centers to make their own without having to do the legwork of getting it up to that basic level of development. Same with Britain and Spain. These regions brought wealth to the urban core of Rome without necessarily having to bear the full brunt of developing the regions from nothing. And these regions did resist quite viciously. Rome had a very hard time conquering all of these places. There were many rebellions, but they were never quite organized enough to truly push the Romans out. But in the regions that were less developed than these ones, Rome was never really able to actually stay. In Scotland or Germany, Rome launched expeditions into the region and even tried to establish footholds, but it was simply too difficult to try and develop the infrastructure and development necessary to make that land holdable for the empire, so it wasn't worth the cost and they were abandoned. Similarly, in Dacia, what we would now call Hungary, the Romans did actually try to colonize the region, but weren't able to hold on to it and had to retreat back behind the Danube River. In all of these cases, what we see is that the Roman Empire was very capable of conquering territories that already had urban development, but when they tried to expand beyond that base level of development, they struggled. It's also worth noting in this, when the Roman Empire finally fell, the Eastern Roman Empire didn't. It lasted 1,000 years longer than the Western Roman Empire did, which I don't think is a coincidence, given that the Eastern Roman Empire had the advantage of developing over thousands of years. Many of the cities in the Eastern Empire were far older than Rome and had been the centers of civilization since it had begun. This was a highly developed, industrious, and wealthy region that Rome was able to march into when it was at its weakest point. They got all of the benefit of that rich, developed land without having to pay really that high of a price at all for it. Meanwhile, the parts of Europe that they had had to put the effort into developing, the Western Roman territories, collapsed very rapidly when they finally did go. And I think part of that is because Rome as an empire was not like it was in its early days. It wasn't innovative and adaptive. It was corrupt. It was arrogant and oligarchic to a very destructive degree. The Roman Empire was a monopoly of power with no political options and an anti-innovative spirit, in fact. All of these provinces were extracted and exploited for the enrichment of the urban core and a small percentage of people. It was a slave empire. All of those regions, if you were a poor peasant in Britain, life didn't necessarily get much worse for you after Rome fell. You were still just a poor peasant. It's just now your goods were stolen by a German warlord instead of stolen by a Roman one. And that's where we get to the core of the idea that maybe the Roman Empire was not so good for Europe, or that the fall of Rome was actually to the benefit of the continent. This is a point made by a historian from Stanford, Walter Schneider, who says that the fall of Rome was actually the best thing that could have happened to Europe. And it's an interesting point. He points out that when Rome fell, it was replaced by new states that had to compete with each other. It ended the trade monopolies and the kleptocracy and the extractive exploitation and the lack of development in regions, allowing a lot of places in Rome that had been spending hundreds of years at that point simply being used for their wealth and left to fester, now turning into more dynamic states that would eventually become globe-spanning empires in their own right, with some of the most advanced industry and technology there was. And here's the final diorama. This is my city of Veii. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And this diorama was slightly rough, but I really like how it turned out. The rocks turned into a nice sort of cliff face that I was hoping for, and while the walls were a little taller than I meant them to be, I do think it really sells it dynamically. You can see at the very back there those kind of gray stones with the colors on them. I was trying to create a necropolis. The Etruscans had these elaborate tombs, but it was hard to paint at scale, so I just used a kind of abstractive colors. And the temples are too big, but I think they really sell the motif.
So yeah, there's the finished product. I'm really pleased with how this one actually came out. It was rough for a fair amount of it, but I really like how the rocks came out, and the appearance of the city with these huge temples, I think, just kind of has a very cool kind of map aesthetic to it. I mean, it's not to scale and particularly realistic, but I learned a lot trying to do this, and it was quite fun. So I'll probably try and do videos like this again in the future, taking lessons from this one. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, a like, comment, and subscribe really does go a long way. And I understand there are going to be people who probably vehemently disagree with the topic. I mean, Roman history is incredible. Lots of people love it, and I can't blame them. I do as well. It's a fascinating and rich history from a time period that we don't have a lot of history for, but that can lead to a certain romanticization, and particularly because most of the sources we have access to were from Romans, and of course, they had a very biased understanding of their world. I hope that this video and this discussion can help to show that the ancient world wasn't a few small bastions of civilization competing with each other in a sea of unenlightened, barbarous enemies, but it was a dynamic world of complicating and ebbing and flowing powers that all had their own unique cultures, achievements, and art, and many of them probably would have ascended to far greater heights had Rome not destroyed them. The Etruscans, I think, are a great example. They were hundreds of years old by the time Rome finally overcame them. They were powerful. They had advanced art and engineering, beautiful works that frankly are as impressive as a lot of what Rome achieved, even its height. But we know so little about these peoples because of Rome's annihilation of them. And there is a tragedy in that I think it's important to recognize. And maybe raise the question, perhaps the Roman Empire was not a good for Europe. But it happened. It's not necessarily about moral judgment, but more about imagining what could have been created by the peoples who Rome snuffed out. Now, again, if you vehemently disagree, leave your comments down below. I won't blame you. But thanks for hearing me out, and thank you for watching. Have a good one.